From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Terry Sierra. I'm the chief of the Serial and Government Publications Division, which is our sponsoring division for this program today. We have with us local historians, W. Douglas Fisher and Joann H. Buckley, who will be discussing their book, African American Doctors of World War I, The Lives of 104 Volunteers. I thought, can you all hear me? Okay? Yeah, okay. All right. I thought I would tell you a little bit about how this came about, this program came about. And here's the story. I hope you find it interesting because program has had the Library of Congress start differently, come from different places. But in this case, it started when we received comments on the National Digital Newspaper Program contact page from some fellow. And he said, and I'm going to read what he said, "My co-author, Joann H. Buckley, and I spent hours at LOC and online working with ProQuest and other digital newspaper archives to develop these biographies. And we are most grateful for them. Without them, we would not have been able to complete our work." So that got our attention. We had to know what was this book and who wrote this book. So at the same time that this came to our attention, one of our librarians, Arlene Balkansky, had the assignment of pulling and getting things together for our World War I exhibit, which if you haven't seen it, I recommend it highly. It's in the Jefferson Building. It's fantastic. So she was in the process of doing that, and it seemed like a natural thing to hand her this information. Well, Arlene ran with it, and within 2 months she was in touch with our authors. She had it all set up. So basically, it took us over a year to get to this point, but here we are. So anyway, I thought you might want to know about that. I also wanted to tell you that one of the things that has touched me about knowing about these folks and their book is that they were both inspired by their grandparents. Both grandfathers served during the war, and Joann's grandmother, whose picture is over there, was a nurse in New York, tending to the wounded as they came back. I was touched by that. Before I turn over the program to them, there are a couple of people that I need to acknowledge who are with us today, and we're very thrilled to have them. They're over there in that corner. We have Dr., I don't know if you're a doctor, but Dr. Urbain Bass's grandson? Yes. Okay. And Dr. Richard Sterling, grandson as well. And we're very pleased that you could make the trip. So one more thing, and I'll move on. Joann and Doug brought a number of artifacts that are part of their collections that are on display. So after our program, after their presentation, please, you can take a couple of minutes to go and look, ask questions, and so forth. They will also be around to sign books. I see that they're being sold in the back if you didn't have them, or you may have it already. So without any more delays here, I give to you Douglas Fisher and Joann H. Buckley.
All right. Now, thank you. Terry, hold on a minute. I'm giving back to Terry. We're giving back to the Library of Congress. We were doing research for 5 and writing for 5 years, and we spent a lot of time in this building. And we gathered all of our material and some of the women in my building sat around my dining room table for a long time, and we reviewed all this material. And then another one had some connections with a scanning company, and we had it scanned, and then we had it made searchable with some wonderful little software. This is 8,000 pages of material that we gathered here at the Library of Congress. And now it's all digitized on one subject, the World War I, the African American doctors. And we're giving it back to the Library of Congress. So here you are, Terry.
Much. We're delighted to
Hope
receive it. Thank you.
We want some new young writer in on this. Doug's grandfather, John North Douglas, commanded the 317th Motor Supply Train of the 92nd Division, an African-American combat unit. Doug was fascinated by his grandfather's letters and diaries, another book, and began his research on the war. Jonathan Rucker was a black doctor who took care of the 500 troops in the supply train. Doug got to know 5 of Rucker's 10 children, even setting up a Rucker family reunion in Natchez, Mississippi. In 2009, I entered Doug's life. I met his family. Then I met the Rucker family. I knew something of World War I. I'd been a history teacher, and 2 of my grandparents had been involved in the war. My grandfather was a sergeant with the 77th Division, a teamster with the artillery unit. My grandmother was a nurse at St. Vincent's in New York, and she took care of the returning wounded. She didn't want any of us to go into nursing after that. Doug wanted to write Rucker's biography. But it was a good story, but I could not believe that Rucker was the only doctor. The Army just doesn't do ones. So we went to Fort Des Moines, where Rucker trained, to find out more. No one, including the curator at Fort Des Moines Museum, where the physicians received their basic training, knew their names or even how many of them there were. We spent months combing through the files here at National Archives before the eureka moment and the discovery of the list. It was in an ancient folder of the U.S. Army Surgeon General's records, so old that the identification tab had disintegrated. It was typed by some clerk 100 years ago on many sheets of paper with columns of information, hometowns, medical schools, graduation years, and ages. The sheets were then glued together, and the resulting document was 4 feet long and 18 inches wide. And then it had been folded in and in until it fit into a standard file. 100 years ago, the United States was largely a country of racial segregation, discrimination, lynching, and Jim Crow laws. These 104 men were among the nation's estimated 1,500 African American doctors. They had succeeded in gaining advanced education and training at a time when it was problematic for any African American to achieve such success. Yet they answered their country's call and left their practices to provide medical care for the fighting men of the 92nd and 93rd Divisions. 60% of these doctors came from just 3 African American medical schools. The largest contingent were graduates of 2 Tennessee medical schools, 34 from Meharry Medical School in Nashville, and 8 from the University of West Tennessee in Memphis. But 16 came from Howard in D.C., 13 from Leonard Medical School at Shaw University in Raleigh, 2 went to Harvard, 3 from the University of Illinois, 2 from the University of Michigan, and 2 from Northwestern's medical school. Why would they enlist? They expected times would be different. After the war, they thought they'd be recognized for their service. They thought all men of their race would benefit. But nothing changed after the war. But many of these men would become the leaders of their communities and organizations like the NAACP that would make racial equality possible. So we had to tell their stories. We spent the next 5 years at the Library of Congress, the National Archives, numerous state and city historical associations, libraries, and with a variety of newspaper sources. We met the children and the grandchildren of these extraordinary men. Initially, we wrote for historical journals and spoke to small groups. Then, after a chance meeting with Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. in the elevator of the Hay Adams Hotel in Washington, well, actually what happened was we had gone to a wedding the night before, and we were coming down to go to breakfast. We got out of the elevator, and we saw Henry Louis Gates checking in. So we stepped over to the side, and we waited until he got in the elevator. And then we jumped in with him. And we started talking as fast as we possibly could. And so he said, "What is this, a hustle?" And Doug said, "Absolutely." So we told him about the project. And so he he said, "I don't have a card, but here I'll repeat my email address. I want you to send me one." And so we did. And in the subject line, we put, "Hey, Adams, hustle." It was a Sunday we sent it. Monday we heard from him. He hired us to write 15 of them. So he wanted shorter ones. We're still writing for him. We're still doing shorter biographies for his African American National Biography. We did this, and then the book came next. And now Doug will talk about the Army in 1917 as we entered the war.
There's your arrow there for advancing.
Okay, I need our water too. This one?
Yes. Thank you for coming. Prior to World War I, the U.S. Army was tiny. 200,000 people spread around the world and around this country, and it was totally segregated. Black officers were virtually non-existent. Nevertheless, between 1917 and 1919, 400,000 African American men served. Most of them were in labor and support units. But 10%, or 40,000 of these troops, served in the combat units that we've talked about, the 92nd and the 93rd Divisions in France. The black officers were trained at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, with 639 line officers completing a special officers training camp, only done once, and 104 doctors, whom we're writing about, completed the medical officers training camp that was there. Things had been written about the officers training camp, but not the medical officers, so we uncovered that. Training for the doctors was rigorous, with a 10-mile march and a 3-day outdoor encampment. In this picture that you can see here, this is a picture of the guys out in their tents at the encampment on the state fairgrounds, and you can see the roller coaster in the background. I don't think they were having a lot of fun, though. The doctors were also given command of medical detachments with 10 enlisted men in each of the detachments, gave them some leadership. After the MOTC training, the doctors were assigned to the 92nd or 93rd Divisions and spread across 8 different U.S. encampments across the country. Then, in 1918, the combat units were sent to France. The 93rd Division, which consisted of 12,000 soldiers in 4 National Guard regiments, arrived overseas first. The French wanted American troops to fill its decimated ranks, so General Pershing gave them the 93rd Division, the 4 regiments of that. And the French loved them. They were terrific. They fought more time, one of the units there fought longer than any other American unit in combat. The 92nd Buffalo Division, consisting of 27,000 men, arrived in mid-1918 and fought with the American 1st and 2nd Armies. That's the unit that my grandfather served in. The 104 doctors were assigned to frontline medical detachments, ambulance companies, and field hospitals, right up front. They endured combat and suffered aerial and artillery attacks. Many were wounded from the effects of exploding gas shells. Gas was a terrible problem in World War I. One doctor was killed in the field. His grandsons are with us here today. Interestingly, almost as many American soldiers died of disease as died in combat in World War I. Army doctors such as ours faced both the enemy and killer diseases, including the horrendous Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 that killed tens of millions of people worldwide. Today we're going to share a glimpse of three of these extraordinary doctors with you, and Joann's going to lead off introducing you to Dr. Thomas E. Jones, who was from this area.
Dr. Thomas E. Jones served with great distinction for more than 5 years in the National Guard and the Army, earning a Distinguished Service Cross, the highest Army decoration for heroism.
Second highest.
The second highest. The military expert. No, he is really. He also earned the French Croix de Guerre for his courage under fire in France. Born in Lynchburg, Virginia, where his father was a merchant, Jones attended public schools and graduated from Lynchburg High School in 1896. He went on to Howard University in Washington, D.C. During college, Jones worked at different times as a newsboy, waiter, messenger, laborer, and watchman. It was hard work, but he was cheerful and determined, and he succeeded. He entered Howard University's medical school in 1908 and graduated with his MD degree in 1912. He interned at D.C.'s Freedman Hospital for a year and was then appointed anesthetist at the hospital, a position he actually held after the war and through till 1917. 1914, he served in the D.C. National Guard as a lieutenant in Company C of the 1st Separate Battalion, an African-American component of the National Guard. 1917, when America entered the First World War, Jones volunteered for the Army Medical Reserve Corps and entered the medical officers training camp at Fort Des Moines. After 60 days of training, he was sent to Camp Meade to join the 368th Infantry Regiment of the 92nd Division, and he served with them throughout the war. Lieutenant Jones received his Distinguished Service Cross and French Croix de Guerre in the Argonne Forest in France. He was also promoted to captain for displaying extraordinary heroism while attending the wounded in an open area under machine gun fire. The Army citation says, quote, "While dressing a wounded runner, a machine gun bullet passed between his arms and his chest, and a man was killed within a few yards of him." Another account of the incident says that under falling shell and machine gun fire, the boys say he walked out and got wounded men with the same coolness that was his when he was putting a patient to sleep for an operation. Following the war, Dr. Jones returned to Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. as resident assistant surgeon. In 1936, he was promoted to the top job, becoming surgeon-in-chief until he retired in 1942 after 27 years of service. He also taught at Howard University's medical school. The Smithsonian has a photograph of Dr. Jones with Eleanor Roosevelt in its collection. He was clearly recognized as a leader in the African American community. His commitment to his community is remarkable. He was an active member of at least 10 national and local benevolent associations. Militarily, he belonged to the League of Valor, whose members are Medal of Honor winners and recipients of the Army Distinguished Service Cross. In 1934, his American Legion post adopted a resolution deploring segregation in civil service and urging the passage of an anti-lynch bill. In 1941, as surgeon-in-chief of Freedmen's Hospital, he represented the medical world in the Second Selective Service drawing in Washington, D.C. for World War II. By 1950, at the age of 70, he was semi-retired. He still maintained an office downstairs in his 4-story house that we found in Washington, D.C. It's a handsome townhouse. He died of a coronary thrombosis 1958, just before his 78th birthday. He was buried with full military honors in Arlington National Cemetery next to his first wife. Dr. Jones believed that the best interest of his race would be promoted by acting for the good of the masses rather than by the accumulation of property, and by investing financially in local community projects. He was an extraordinary, patriotic, courageous, well-respected, and hard-working physician and community leader. And now Doug will talk about another of our doctors.
Thanks, Joanne. Our next distinguished MOTC graduate is a Dr. William Holmes, also known as Billy Dyer. And he's featured in a book by Cliff Cleveland entitled Healers and Heroes, published back in 2004 by the American College of Physicians in Philadelphia. You can see his picture there, the arrows pointing to him. He's one of the 6 that they featured there. He was also the subject of a 1992 book by an author, William Maxwell, entitled Billy Dyer and Other Stories. Billy was a personal friend of William Maxwell's. Dr. Dyer also served in the Buffalo Division along with my grandfather, Captain Douglas. Dyer's written accounts and descriptions, which we found in the Schomburg up in New York, in the library up there, his descriptions of France helped us paint really vivid mental images of what they experienced. His hometown of Lincoln, Illinois, is halfway between St. Louis and Chicago. After graduation from Lincoln College and the University of Illinois Medical School in 1916, he interned in Kansas City. Internships were very dear, very hard to find for black physicians in those years. After Dyer volunteered for Army service, he received orders to proceed to Fort Des Moines. When he left Lincoln, 300 people saw him off at the train station. Amazing. His diary recorded his disappointment with his quarters when he reached the fort at Fort Des Moines, which he described as a cold room in a stable. A lot of people were very happy with that. And harrowing wartime experience clearly shows that in combat, he gained an appreciation for the value of the drills. After completing his training, he was assigned as the medical officer to the 92nd Division's 317th Ammunition Train. He was assigned in Camp Funston, Kansas, out in the Midwest. En route from Hoboken, New Jersey, New York basically, to Brest, France, Lieutenant Dyer's assignment at sea was to give physical examinations to 600 men. He said the only excitement during the voyage was on June 21st, 1918, when shots were fired from all the surrounding ships at what proved to be a floating beer keg. Dyer wrote that once in France, the 317th was marched to a barracks that had been a prison camp during the time of Napoleon. He said it was a terrible and dirty old place. In a letter home, my grandfather described these same barracks as being badly crowded, with no beds or cots, and wrote that they were supplied with French beds, which consisted of 3 1-inch by 12-inch planks, pine planks, fastened together with 2 cleats at the bottom to keep them from lying flat on the floor. There was no straw, and they were very uncomfortable. It was called a rest camp, where troops regained their land legs and rest after the 3-week ocean voyage. My grandfather wrote that the term rest was a gross misnomer, saying, "I defy anyone to rest there." The officers were assigned to a small room downstairs. It was damp, musty, and smelled of urine and fecal matter. There was a stone floor, and there were no lights available, but they had a few candles. It was summer, and the weather was drizzly and disagreeable. The flies were thick and ravenous, and the windows were not screened. My grandfather's letter reported the men were touchy for want of sleep and food. They were not fed from early morning until late in the afternoon. He said, finally, got a few bedding rolls. Mine is missing. Got 4 used blankets from a guardhouse. They smelled awful. The atmosphere seems thoroughly saturated with a fecal odor. Fortunately, after several days, they boarded trains going eastward to the division's training area at Bourbon-les-Bains. Then at the end of August, they were on the move again to the front. Dyer recalled the convoy drove without lights, and they kept passing broken-down Army vehicles and infantrymen who, because of fatigue, had fallen out of line to rest. They always traveled at night. The convoy destination was Raon-l'Étape in the eastern Vosges Mountains, which was described as a desperate place full of graves, where Dyer said he gave up counting the houses with the roofs gone. After nearly a month in the mountains, they moved up to the Argonne forest. Dyer wrote, quote, "No accommodations here, not even water to drink or cook with. Mud everywhere, over shoe tops. While camped in this wet, filthy woods, many of our boys became ill from the dampness, cold, and exposure, thereby causing me much work and worry caring for them." On September 25th, at the outset of the great Meuse-Argonne campaign, the 47-day campaign where more lives were lost than ever before in any battle with American troops, Dyer said, quote, "The old woods trembled as if by earthquake. The flashes of the cannon lighted up the inside of our tents, and our ears were deafened. At the hospital, Dyer saw a steady stream of ambulances bringing wounded soldiers. The dead were also being brought back on trucks, piled like cordwood and dripping blood." In early October, the 92nd Division was transferred to the AEF's 2nd Army, and Dyer was sent southeast through a wasteland which he said, in which even the grass was burned. And they were sent to the village of Belleville on the Moselle River. He set up an infirmary and a small electrical plant there. Because of the constant cold and rainy weather, there was a great deal of sickness among the African American troops. The division's artillery had been in training in the south of France, separated, since July, and Dyer wrote that Major Howard, my commanding officer, from whom I'd been separated about 4 months, called to see me and complimented me on my good work. He was very pleased with that. All through October and early November, the 317th Ammunition Train labored on. Everyone was hearing much talk of peace and preparing for the final drive. The 92nd was part of a large attack on the city of Metz, a German stronghold, throughout the war. The attack began in earnest on November 9th, 1918, and in it the division suffered many casualties. The war, essentially ended 2 days later with the November 11th armistice on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Lieutenant Dyer wrote a month later, in December 1918, he was awakened by an orderly. In a heavy fog, a passenger train had plowed into a troop train full of happy French soldiers returning home from the front. The bodies of the dead and dying were pinned under the wreckage. He spent the night, he said, dressing wounds and putting splints on broken arms and broken legs. Then 3 days later, on December 18th, the 317th began to leave Belleville on foot. 6 days later, after traveling on foot, by truck, and train, they finally reached the village of Domfront in Normandy in the rain and the snow on Christmas Eve, where even the people of Domfront took them in. Finally, 2 months later, on the morning of February 22nd, 1919, the 317th marched to Brest Harbor, where they were ferried out to the ship Aquitania for the trip home. Dyer said his cabin had, quote, mahogany fittings and a private bath, taps for fresh and salt water, and soap. a far cry from anything he'd experienced or encountered during his time in France. Then after the war, he established his medical practice in Kansas City. In addition to his private medical practice, he served as a surgeon for the Santa Fe Railroad, an enormous enterprise at the time. He was invited to join the American Association of Railway Surgeons in 1946, and in 1947 he was the lone Negro member present among 400 surgeons who attended the 58th Annual Convention at the Palmer House in Chicago. He was quoted as saying, "I was quite interested in the types of operations for mangled hands and feet, for quite frequently we railroad physicians have to care for victims of railroad accidents and wrecks." He was also the surgeon for the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. A 1947 news article said he served as the lone police surgeon there for many years. He was honored in 1953 by his home city of Lincoln, Illinois, at its centennial celebration as one of its 10 most distinguished men and the only Negro. In January 1956, at 70 years old, he wrote from Kansas City to an old friend in California saying, "In the last 4 months, I've been put on the staffs of 3 of the major hospitals in our city. I thought at first it was an honor, but with the increase in activities which such appointments entail, my work has increased twofold. Since it was the first time that one of my race had had such appointments, I've been working diligently to make good, thereby keeping those doors open." At age 70, he was still a surgeon for the Santa Fe Railroad and the Kansas City Police Department. He died in 1958 at age 71 and was buried in a mixed-race cemetery in Lincoln, Illinois. And now Joann will talk to you about Dr. Bass.
Dr. Urbane Bass was the only one of the 104 African American doctors of the 92nd and 93rd Divisions killed in action in France. About 5 years ago, Doug and I climbed into the choir loft at the Fredericksburg Shiloh Baptist Church to get pictures of this extraordinary stained glass window that was installed by the congregation in his memory. Bass was born in Richmond, Virginia, to Rosa and Richard J. Bass. His father was a salesman, shoes and clothing in the 1880s, insurance in the 1900s. His mother stayed home with the 6 children. The family lived in Richmond on East Duval Street. Urbane worked as a clerk while in school. He graduated from Virginia Union University in Richmond in 1902. And then went on to Leonard Medical School of Shaw University in Raleigh in 1906. After graduating from Leonard, he married Maud Vass, the sister of his medical school classmate, Rufus Vass. And then he opened a medical practice and pharmacy on William Street in Richmond, Virginia. By 1909, he'd moved his practice and his pharmacy north to Fredericksburg. He was the city's first African-American physician since Reconstruction. The practice located on Amelia Street was well received by the African-American community in spite of the local hospital's denial of privileges to Bass. By 1916, his practice and his family were growing. In 1917, this father of 4 wrote to Secretary of War Newton Baker offering his services. One of Bass's friends, J.B. Morris, told his family, "Dr. Bass was dedicated to serving his country in a time of critical need. He knew our men were going to die in France and told me that he would give his life to save them, if he had to. I could see the sincerity in his eyes," Morris said. He was committed to the end. Bass received his commission as first lieutenant in the Medical Reserve Corps and was 37 years old when he reported to duty at Fort Des Moines on August 14, 1917. After basic medical officer training at Fort Des Moines, he and Rufus Bass were sent to Camp Funston, Kansas. Bass went to France with the 372nd Infantry Regiment of the 93rd Division, which was immediately turned over to the French and sent to the front lines. On October 17, 1918, he was frantically working on wounded soldiers at a forward aid station under heavy German fire. He was hit with shrapnel when a shell exploded near him. Both of his legs were severed. While he was dying, he actually continued to direct medics on how to treat his wounds. He died before he could be taken from the field. Bass was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, and that citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism in action near Montbois, France, on October 1st through 5th in 1918. Lieutenant Bass, it said, administered first aid in the open and under prolonged and intense shell fire until he was severely wounded and carried from the field," unquote. It was the policy then that if someone died in the field, they were buried until they could be returned to the United States. So he died in 1918. He was not returned for reburial until July of 1921. He became the first African-American commissioned officer to be buried in Fredericksburg National Cemetery. He lies in Officers' Row near the entrance to the cemetery. The Social Services building in Fredericksburg is named the Bass Ellison building in honoring him and Richard C. Ellison, another African-American doctor who served the community. And back to the Shiloh Baptist Church. You really have to go to Fredericksburg and see this to believe it. But you can see from the inscription there that the community was very much in his debt and very distraught about losing him at the war during the war. Dr. Bass had a love worthy of envy when he married Maud Bass. The couple had 4 children, 3 daughters, Anne, Frances May, and Ruth, and 1 son, Urbane F. Bass. After his death, Maud was a widow at age 32. She had quite a difficult time accepting his death. In 1922, she was staying with a family in Washington, D.C., when she was taken to a Washington asylum because of her violent, nervous state. A few weeks earlier, she had attempted suicide by jumping from a 2-story window. It was her father, the Reverend Samuel N. Bass, who had her committed for care for several months. Early in 1923, she and the 4 children moved back to her hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina. There she raised her family and taught music to the blind for 30 years at the North Carolina State School for the Blind. Maud and her vast family saw that all 4 children were well educated for productive lives. Daughter Frances May Bass graduated from Shaw University. She completed some graduate work at Columbia University and then worked for the Durham City School System for nearly 30 years. She married Charles Clinton Spaulding of Durham, General Counsel of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Ruth graduated from Shaw University and obtained a master's degree from the University of Michigan. She taught at Mary Ellen's Teachers College in Crockett, Texas, before marrying Moses Newsom. The couple then moved to Charleston, West Virginia, where the Reverend was the pastor of the First Baptist Church. Anne married Richard Sterling and moved to Washington, D.C. Urbane Bass Jr. followed in his father's footsteps and became a physician. And we are honored that we have two of the Bass grandchildren with us today. Thank you.
Now, in closing, let me say we've enjoyed sharing with you a glimpse of the lives of these three really extraordinary doctors. Doctors Jones, Dyer, and Bass were only three of the 104 African American doctors who answered their country's call. Excuse me. What all of the 104 doctors endured as black men in a Jim Crow world, and what they accomplished despite society's racial divide, is truly remarkable. Few lived to see the civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s enacted, but their efforts and accomplishments definitely helped pave the way for it. The 18 months that these doctors spent serving in the Army between 1917 and 1919 provided them with new medical skills and life experiences well beyond what they'd learned in their medical school lessons. Their new organization and leadership skills were unique for most physicians. Most were able to use these skills and continue to serve our nation and their African American communities for decades. The story of these patriotic men in World War I was lost history for 100 years. We're just delighted and pleased we rediscovered it so it can be shared with you and future scholars a century later. Thank you very much for your time and attention. We'd be glad to answer questions, and we have some things there you could look at over there. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, I just want to thank you both so much. And yeah, if you want to ask questions, the one thing we ask is that you have to repeat the questions, right? You have to repeat the questions so it'll be on the webcast. And thank you so much, Joann and Doug, for your presentation. It was so eye-opening, and I just think it was terrific, and I hope people have more questions.
Thank you.
By the time of World War II, the Army was still segregated. Did they have separate training camps for the doctors during World War II? Had they learned from the World War I experience?
They did not have a special training camp. This was the only one in history, was this one at Fort Des Moines in the First World War. There were reserve units that had been developed, and so you still had National Guard units and reserve units. You had people slightly better prepared for the Second World War than we were for the First, but not terribly well. Yeah.
I was just wondering, as I was listening to you and looking at all those pictures, how did they get medications out to the field? Did they have a way did they carry it with them?
The question was, how did they get medications and things to the field? Actually, they had a medical unit. They called it a sanitary train. There was a 317th sanitary train, and that was all of the medics, the doctors, and it included people that were doing logistics. And so my grandfather's supply train, for example, would be carrying medicines and things to the front. The difficulty was that the Germans, by this time, had decent aviation, and they also had artillery in place, and it was a static front. So it was very hard to move things around during the daytime. So it all had to be done in the dark at night with blackouts. I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, thank goodness the moon came out a few times to help them get these things done. But they would move things up to a forward aid station and take the bandages, the basic bandages, so on, and then they would come back to an ambulance company where there would be more logistics, and then they would come back to a field hospital, where they would be there, and then they would be triaged into base hospitals, which were even further back if they were not able to recover there. But it's the logistics and the organization that it takes to run an army. I mean, the division had 28,000 men. That's a lot of people. It took days to move them, It took lots of trucks, lots of trains, and lots of people walking long distances just to move them from one location to the next. If you look at there's one map over here that shows the disposition of these forces at the end of the war in December, and you can imagine, I mean, it's just miles. It's miles in this direction, miles in that direction to get 28,000 people dispersed and organizationally. They learned a lot about organization and how to organize hospitals in the process. Yes, thank you.
Were the base hospitals also segregated?
I don't believe so. I think, no, I can't imagine that they were. Actually, the hospitals were segregated within the hospital, but they didn't have a black base hospital. So they had segregation within it, but you didn't have that many people who were moved back to the base hospitals. If you didn't die in the front, then you would be disfigured perhaps from the shrapnel and then the gas, but the numbers were much different. There were 200,000 African Americans in the combat zone over there, but only 40,000 of them were in actual combat. That's dwarfed by the size of the white officers and the white soldiers that were there. So there were many more of them that had to be cared for. Yes. Yes.
Yes, how many families did you get a chance to interview when you were doing research?
What do you think? A dozen? 15? 20?
Maybe 20.
Maybe 20. Mm-hmm. Well, we met two people today that we'd never talked to before. Urbane Bass and Mr. Sterling, the grandsons of Dr. Urbane Bass here. And so we continue to have people reach out as they learn the story and so on. We had one very interesting experience in Los Angeles. There's one of the physicians is named Claudius Ballard, and he fought with the French. Quite an interesting guy. He's a good story in here, too. But his son is now in his 90s. We spent some time with his son. He's a retired fire chief in Los Angeles. And we spent time with his grandson, who's a minister out in Los Angeles. We did this just a couple months ago when we were coming back from a trip to the West. The family people have learned so much from us, and we've learned so much from the families. It's been a wonderful exchanging of information. It's a lot of these children and grandchildren were born after the war. So what did their dads or granddads tell them about the war? Usually not much. We've been able to give them a lot of information that they had no idea about, and then they've been able to give us a lot as well.
When we were at Ballard, the son, at his unit, when we were at his home, we were telling him, because he and his father never could talk, never, it was like he came back and this was his reaction to battle. And so the son, anyway, he went off and he left the family. And so the son was so angry about that the father had received the Croix de Guerre. And when we were sitting in his living room and we were telling him about what his father went through at the 93rd and what a horrendous, time he had and everything, finally he says to his son, upstairs under the bed, there's a picture, why don't you go and get it? And it was his father's Croix de Guerre. The beautiful picture of it. So he brought it down to share it with his son for the first time. So this was, not unusual, though there's so much death and destruction there that they would come back with battle fatigue or whatever they call it now. So we saw that. We were there when this kind of realization came to the family. That was very rewarding.
It's actually changed the way he feels about his father.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was very moved by that.
Yes, Richard.
I have one question. It's something not very important, but was my grandfather on the front line when he was killed? Was he treating the soldiers on the front line?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
The question was, was his father in the front line when he was killed?
Grandfather.
Grandfather on the front lines when he was killed, and the answer is yes, most definitely. He was at a forward aid station. The forward aid stations are right up there with the regiments. He was with the regiment. They were right there. Indeed.
Yes.
You said he received Distinguished Service Cross, I believe.
Yes.
Do you know when he received that?
I don't know offhand. He received it posthumously, obviously, but I don't know the actual date it was received. But it was in that time frame. It was not 50 years later or something of that sort.
You could probably find out from the Army. In fact, you could probably get a copy of it or get a copy of the medal and the citation by contacting the Army. Even the Army Museum, do you think, in Arlington?
We probably can find it for you in our research papers.
Yeah, because we have done that trying to, yes, we'll look.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Sure, by all means.
I have 3 very short questions. Are Dr. Dyer's accounts of the Schomburg in the form of diaries or letters?
What he wrote was letters that were later typed, transcribed, and so there's about a 24-page double-spaced document that he wrote about his experiences at the Schomburg. And we have a copy, we got a copy of that. And it was fascinating reading because I could blend it with my grandfather's comments about the same place at the same time. The ammunition train was here, the supply train was here, they were all moving together. It was very vivid.
Quick questions. Can you repeat what you said at the beginning of the program about the beautiful music that was playing? You get credit for it. And can you say a word about your collection that's on display?
Okay, yes, certainly. Could we comment about the music that we were playing before? There's an album, it's a DVD now, and it's obviously available online, about the James Reese Europe Band, which was the band for the 369th Infantry Regiment. James Reese Europe was a famous musician, and he'd been recruited by the commanding officer of the Harlem Hellfighters, they call them, to serve as their band. Every unit had a band for marching and for parades and so on. He recruited some other great musicians in New York. When the band got to France, it brought jazz to France, to Europe. And the French absolutely loved it. And you can imagine those tunes in the time of war, how they were embraced. I mean, it was spirited music, and it gave you a good sense of spirit uplifting.
Jazz clubs in Paris, you know. This jazz is a very important part of Paris. So if you go to Paris, do go to the jazz clubs, because this is where it came from.
Well, I downloaded I'd heard a lot of the music, but I downloaded it onto my cell phone. So I plugged the cell phone in here, and that's what we were hearing earlier.
And then she asked
And
about,
you had a last question? Oh, about the collection over here? The collection, a friend of mine served on a board with me at a bank, and one of his uncles had this collection, and it actually is much bigger than this. And he didn't know what to do with it. He was ill, so he asked me if I could take it over and share it with someone. So we went to the National World War I Museum out in Kansas City, Missouri, showed them all the stuff we had. I mean, there are 50, 60 pieces of things, and they loved it, and they asked for about a half of it. We donated about a half of it, and it's there at the museum in Kansas City. And then we kept pieces of it. Some of it is still in our house, but they wouldn't let us bring the bayonets into the Library of Congress. They were afraid we might get killed, I guess. So there is some, that's the story there on the collection here. Yes?
I was just curious, since we have these visitors,
Mhm.
guests, how did they find out about the program, and did they tell you what they knew about their grandfather?
Well, we've had some conversations with that. Joann reached out to Dr. Bass.
I found him in the internet.
Uh-huh.
There was an article about his fishing. And it said that he was living in Washington, D.C. And so I looked him up and called him. And so we have been communicating back and forth since then. But he already had purchased 7 of our books for his family and everything. I wasn't aware he was here, and I guess you guys weren't aware we were here. So we've all been in this area.
So he's another hero for buying so many books.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us a little more about the collection that
Well, what Joann can tell you all about that because she's the lady that really put it all together. But we have a batch for each physician. We had files for each doctor, so those were all scanned and they're all searchable as PDFs. So there are 104 of those. Plus, there's a lot of background information that we have, general information in there. It's all our research, and some of it was duplicated. Because you get it from so many different directions. So we tried to eliminate a lot of the duplication. But I think it's all there. Is there anything more you can add?
No, we didn't do many of the photographs because that wasn't working well. So they will find their way somewhere, maybe the Army Museum.
Yeah, the National Army Museum that they're building down here at Fort Belvoir. So it's going to be a $250 million museum. The Army's never had a museum. Mm-hmm. The Marines got one down the road on 95. Yeah. The Army needs one too. The Air Force has one, I guess, out at Wright Pat in Dayton, Ohio. So the Army's a little bit behind. They have smaller ones at different places at Fort Benning and different bases, posts. But there's never been a national museum for the Army. So they're hard at work building there, and we've been supporting that activity, and we will probably donate whatever they would like to have to that one as well.
I just want to thank you both for your diligence in terms of your research, continuing to look for the names and discovering them as you did in the Rico moment at the National Archives. Because if it wasn't for you, this information would not be able to be disseminated in the way that it has. And I greatly appreciate y'all's efforts and what y'all have done with it. And I hope y'all continue to do your research for others in that particular book.
Thank you, Irving. We really appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.